After successfully relaunching their brand with their 8-inch scale line of figures, Mego started to look at reigniting their 14-inch scale line as well. Initially, this was kept just to the DC superheroes, but in recent years we've seen them begin to experiment with other lines. So we start to see the Universal Monster line, we've had a Dracula, Frankenstein, and of course the creature from the Black Lagoon, but we're also starting to see it with Star Trek as well. Now, until recently, I've been fairly hesitant to get started on this line, as the scale just seemed a little bit at odds with everything else in my collection. 14 inches is neither a 12-inch figure, a 1/6 scale figure, but it's also a good deal shorter than a quarter scale at 18 inches. So it feels like it's somewhere in between. It's really its own scale all by itself, and it doesn't really fit with the other figures in my collection. So for that reason alone, I've always felt a little bit of resistance with this line. But when the creature from the Black Lagoon was announced, I was so impressed with their 8-inch scale, I thought I had to put my money down and get this guy. So without much further ado, let's dig in. First of all, we'll start with the packaging as always. Now the packaging in this figure is fairly bland, fairly straightforward, quite simple design. It is reliant mostly on that window packaging showing the figure in all its glory there, which is pretty cool, and I think the colours are nicely chosen. The sort of green piping and the deeper darker blue, both in the background and the foreground, works quite nicely to highlight the green of the merman. So I think this looks pretty cool, and I like the creature from the Black Lagoon text that we have there. I think that looks pretty solid. The design of the reverse of the packaging is interesting. The background image looks like it is still taken from the film, or at least replicating something we would see in the film. Black and white image, obviously representing that cove or bay where the merman would be found. So I quite like this touch. I like the black and white. It's just a shame that we don't have an image of the merman himself. Instead we have this cartoon image, which looks okay, but it looks a little bit silly against that backdrop in my opinion. Now this might be a rights issue, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know why they didn't just use a photo of the merman from the film, but maybe there's some issues there. Other than that, there's not an awful lot going on here in terms of the packaging and the design. There is a nice message saying collect them all. Would have been kind of cool if there'd been some images of some of the other figures in the line just to get us all a bit excited, but sadly they are missing. So I think this is fairly displayable, but yeah, it looks a little bit off. So then the figure himself. Now, anyone who's seen my Universal Monsters Mego video that I did for Halloween will know that I was a huge fan of the 8-inch scale of this figure. And I have to say the good news is that for the most part they have essentially just upscaled that figure to 14 inches. Now, the creature was my absolute favourite in the 8-inch scale line. And a lot of that was to do with the sculpting and the paint apps that were applied to him. So if we look at this head sculpt, we can see that this is a pretty good likeness of what we see on screen. I think it's definitely caught the gills and the facial expression of that merman. I think they've done a very, very nice job of it. And of course he has those bright eyes as well, which I think look a little bit better on the 8-inch scale. Here they look a little bit, well, like they've been painted on, I suppose. But nevertheless, I think they still look quite striking. And I think what really sets off this sculpt is the fantastic paint apps as well, because not only do we have that base green plastic, but we also have the black wash running through it, which makes it look very textured, quite authentic, quite realistic in its own way. He's also given this hard plastic chest and shoulder piece as well, which I think just adds a little bit extra texture. It makes it look a bit more authentic, and I just think it looks really quite good. Again, that is treated to the same paint wash, so it's consistent with the head sculpt, and it helps sort of merge and blend into the rest of the costume of this figure, which I think is a really clever touch, and I think it works tremendously well. So Mego get top marks for this in my book. I'm also a big fan of the bodysuit cloth costume that they've tailored for this figure as well, because I think the design and the pattern is really, really very nicely done. It looks pretty authentic to what we see on screen, it looks very accurate, but also it's just got lots of nice colours in it. It looks really seamless, like it is all one skin, and they do look like scales, and I just think they've done a really nice job of it. Again, the colours that are very complementary throughout the figure, so we have the lighter greens, the darker greens and the blacks, and I just think it all comes together so it looks really, really good. Now, one of the things that I felt worked quite well with the 8-inch scale was the fins. They're on the arms, the lower back, and they're on the legs. These are sewn in but harder material pieces that can be manipulated to create that thin effect. So they look pretty good on the 8-inch scale. I'm not as convinced on this 14-inch scale. In fact, I think for the 14-inch scale, they probably should have utilised the hard plastic. This would have looked a lot better. That had been sewn in there. It would have looked a bit better, I think. Yeah, the material here looks a little bit silly. It just doesn't look quite right at this scale. Worked very well for the 8-inch, but not so much here for the 14-inch, in my opinion. We do have these fantastic hands, which I still think look amazing, except they're just on a larger scale this time around. Again, very nicely sculpted and very nicely painted. Fantastic stuff. And of course, the same rings true for the feet as well. Now, the one difference I notice here is that the bodysuit tends to ride up quite high, so you definitely see the ankles a lot more, which obviously are a luminous bright green, which don't look quite so striking, and definitely is a bit incongruous with the overall seamless look of this figure. So that's a little bit of a shame. The costume rides up a bit here, but otherwise, you know, the sculpt of these feet are absolutely fantastic. Now then, in terms of articulation, this is where things get a little bit interesting. It differ a little bit from the 8-inch line. So he has a swivel at the neck, not a great surprise. The head can spin 360 degrees. He does have a ball joint at the shoulder, but as you can see, there is a little bit of resistance to how far that shoulder can rise up because of the hard plastic of the chest piece there. But he can swing his arms up and out, and there's still a pretty decent healthy range of motion here. Now, he can also bend his arms to 90 degrees because he does have a single joint there. He's also got a pin swivel at the wrist, so of course his hand can hinge forwards and backwards and rotate 360 degrees. Now, he also has a ball joint in his waist, which means, of course, he can rotate right the way around. He can sort of lean and arc from left to right. He can spin from side to side, and he can also bend forwards and backwards a little bit as well. Although you'll see it's not a huge range of motion, it's really just a wobble forwards and backwards, but nevertheless, very pleased to have it. He's also got a hinge at the hip, so the legs can really kick out a good distance to the side there. They can kick all the way forwards, and they can also come back a little bit as well. So really strong stuff here, which is nice to see. He also seems to have a double joint in the knees. Now, it can look a little bit strange when you flex it all the way like this, but how often are you going to do that, to be honest? But yeah, I'm really glad to have this articulation. I think that works really well. And then he's got, of course, another pin swivel at the ankle there. So, of course, he can hinge his foot forwards and backwards a good distance, and they spin 360 degrees. Now then, for the sake of scale, just to show you how this figure measures up against others in the collection, how he's kind of at odds, here he is with my 1/6 scale Sideshow Planet of the Apes Taylor figure. So as you can see, he does tower above him, and I think in this context, I think that might work quite well if Taylor visited Planet of the Mermen instead of Planet of the Apes. It could have been a very different story, and I think this kind of works. Now, I think obviously the creature should be roughly human size, so he's probably a little bit too tall here, but I think when you're dealing with monsters, it doesn't matter so much if they tower over their human counterparts, in my opinion. So, final thoughts, I really like this figure. I think it's a fantastic sculpt, very nice paint job, great costume, just as we saw with the 8-inch scale. Now, if you own that 8-inch, you know exactly what you're going to get, and if you like it, you're going to get more of it just on a bigger scale. So for me, that's a massive win for this figure. That said, there's little things I wish they tweaked for this size of this figure. I wish that, obviously, you'd had the plastic piece, the plastic fins, rather than the material fins. I think it would have been enhanced. I think the eyes could have been done with a slight rework, a slight different paint job there, because obviously he's bigger, it's more noticeable, so it would have been nice to just have something else going on there, a bit more detail in the eyes. But other than that, I still think it's a pretty fantastic figure. The articulation is slightly better, of course, because they're not held together with rubber bands, so they're a bit more solid. You can get a better range of motion in terms of posability, which I think is fantastic. So I think if you're on the fence about this figure, I would recommend picking him up, but if you weren't impressed with that 8-inch, then probably steer clear. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as there'll be plenty more videos soon.